The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here in the Faculty of Arts and Design. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and also to pay my respects to all First Nations people who are present today. So today I'm introducing Dr. Emma Philllips. Emma is a photographer, researcher and lecturer in visual communication. Her work focuses on the way that image making might be informed by classist, sexist and gendered assumptions, and uses photographic methodologies which foreground the representational experiences of women and non-binary people. Emma has 12 years professional photography experience in Australian media, design and advertising, and 8 years experience teaching in photography and visual communications programs across Melbourne, Sydney and of course here in Canberra. She completed her PhD on the intersection of sexy selfies with class and has been a finalist in the National Photographic Portrait Prize. Emma is currently researching the visual cultures of elite women athletes. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks so much everyone for coming. I say that genuinely, but also kind of with fear, because I know many of you and I find this quite a terrifying process to stand in front of my peers and do this. Sam's shaking his head. I thank you. I wish you were all strangers. It's because I care about you all, you see. All right. So today, obviously, I'm going to talk about sexy selfies, feminism, moral panics, and how aesthetics are classed, and how photography as a research method can help us unpack a bit of this stuff. I'm going to talk about Kim Kardashian also quite a lot. This work comes out of my doctoral studies where I collaborated with women who take sexy selfies to produce new photographs of them, with them. These co-created images were then used to compare and contrast with their own images to facilitate conversations on the often gendered and classed discourses which accompany selfies, and particularly sexy selfies, but more on that later. The April 2014 issue of Vogue magazine sent many popular media commentators, celebrities and regular consumers into a spin for its depiction of famous selfie taker Kim Kardashian and her husband Kanye West on its cover. I feel like we should ban Kanye from all forms of public discourse right now, but anyway. Despite above average sales, a backlash ensued which decried the decision to promote the couple in this way. Suggestions abounded that Kardashian and West might not be Vogue worthy. And social media lit up with comments such as, "Disgusting! These two are the epitome of vulgarity. You, Vogue, will never recover from this low." Celebrities like Sarah Michelle Gellar got in on the act, declaring that they'd never buy the magazine again. Much of the animosity at the inclusion of Kimmy on the cover stemmed from a desire by critics to protect a magazine seen as much too rarefied and civilised a precinct to welcome a multi-platinum musician and his reality star fiancé. This rarefied space had, according to dissenters, been compromised by trashy interlopers pretending, as British scholar Beverly Skeggs would suggest, to be respectably middle class. Therefore, they weren't deserving of their space on Vogue's cover. The issue is one of transgression and unspoken rules about who gets to access these kinds of culturally valuable domains. In reference to her decision to place Kardashian and West on the cover of Vogue, Editor-in-Chief Anna Wintour acknowledged this breach of a culturally sanctioned boundary when she noted that there is always a time when you know you have to break the rules. When pressed further to justify her decision, Wintour said, I think if we just remain deeply tasteful and just put deeply tasteful people on the cover, it would be a rather boring magazine. Kardashian and West, according to Wintour, are clearly not deeply tasteful, and in identifying this, Wintour brings rich insight into what troubled so many about their presence on Vogue's cover. Why is Kimmy's so-called tastelessness so problematic? And why did Kardashian receive more criticism than her husband? One particularly important element of Kardashian's persona is the extensive work she's done visualising herself and managing her brand through her selfies. She's the selfie queen, and she's even published a photographic book of her own selfies. When this expert in self-representation was photographed by a professional photographer in a space that's marked as high culture, it led to visceral reactions, raising important issues about class, aesthetics, femininity, isn't it tough? And the place of self-photography, selfies, in relation to these discourses. Kardashian has been called vulgar and tasteless in a variety of contexts. Vogue could not simply place one of Kim's photographs on the front cover. Instead, she had to be made over, dressed and photographed in a way that better suits the aesthetic codes of a high culture magazine. The concept of taste functions in these culturally significant spaces as a way to mark class boundaries, even if this is not acknowledged in the kinds of discourses I just mentioned. Responses of disgust, such as those directed at Kardashian, support this function and are performed in the interests of gatekeeping such spaces from those whose tastes do not align with the dominant group. This is to maintain, as it were, a set of values and aesthetics that would otherwise be compromised by the so-called interloper. Just as the arbitrary Victorian-era designation of proper table manners functioned to protect middle and upper-class arenas from working-class impropriety, arbitrary designations of tastefulness in feminine presentations now serve the same purpose. Kardashian, in particular, has been consistently marked with class language like vulgar, trashy, hashtag Kardash trash is something you see around the socials, and tasteless, and much of this relates to her refusal to conform to middle-class standards of proper, demure femininity and polite sexual decorum, standards which have, incidentally, lingered since Victorian times. Instead, she's chosen to display her body publicly in ways that are sexually overt, often through sexy selfies, and challenge the norms of middle-class properness and respectability. As Skeggs argues, the concept of femininity is classed and has been constructed as docile and fragile in opposition to working-class and black bodies, which are defined as robust, masculine and contagious. Such bodies in a sexual context come to be regarded as excessive and in need of correcting, a phenomenon which can be seen, for example, on multiple reality makeup television programs that seek to improve working class women to normative standards, and also in the responses to Kardashian's Vogue cover. Now, this is not to suggest that Kim Kardashian is working class, and the term, of course, is problematic in all contemporary contexts at the moment, but that her cultural positioning provides a kind of bellwether for understanding aesthetic hierarchies and gaining insight into how middle-class cultural fields are demarcated, especially those concerned with representations of the female body. This intersects with mainstream middle-class feminism as it positions Kardashian's self-representational choices as antithetical to certain feminist ideals. Where feminism seeks freedom for women from socially constructed and damaging beauty norms, it views Kardashian as a promoter of them. And where feminism seeks to dismantle the objectifying presence of the vernacular male gaze, it sees Kardashian as self-objectifying for that gaze. What's missing from the mainstream feminist assessment of her, however, is any serious critical attention to feminism's own class structures and the blind spots this creates for its broader project of achieving gender justice. The concentration on Kardashian's self-presentations and, by extension, everyday sexy selfie takers as problematic has obviated, in its view, any need to assess its own classed symbolic violences. Such violences make Kardashian disgusting and mask an alternative project of protecting middle-class cultural and feminist fields. Women who present this way are not performing the right or appropriate type of femininity and should therefore expect to have their bodies and their dress regulated by arbiters of so-called good taste. To return to Wintour, Kim, of all of them, she says, I feel has possibly changed the most. I personally admire the way she's become a little bit more minimal in the way that she's dressing and a little bit more covered. Kardashian's growing aesthetic modesty has met with gatekeeper approval, and she has been duly granted access to the culturally valuable Vogue cover. Wintour's approval of Kardashian's choice to change is symptomatic of what Skeggs would refer to as the great class project and pressure, of the great project and pressure of becoming middle class. Can mainstream feminism critically take account of this? Can it address how it wants women to present, not just how it doesn't want them to present? Should there be limits placed on women's sexy self-representations? If so, what might they be? Though sexy imagery is certainly not new, sexy selfies are a relatively new phenomenon which have, amongst other things, fed into the so-called sexualisation debates. These debates have been going for around 15 years and look a little bit like this. So I know most of you will have come across these kinds of headlines before, so these are all actual headlines, but are somewhat representative of what mainstream journalism will do with this issue. And the second slide are academic critiques of the sexualisation debates. And you'll see that there's a similarity in tone. There's a bit less Gwyneth Paltrow there, but similarity in tone certainly. And this issue of concern really comes through in the feminist critiques of the sexualisation debates. Though the media landscape has changed, moral panics of this nature remain. They operate in discourses of protectionism and in the active policing of women's bodies through cultural intermediaries such as Vogue and Anna Wintour, and in feminist argument that suggests female sexual self-representation is a fallacy of choice. Many have noted that the justification for such interventions is through the feminist aim of female bodily safety. I argue that the interventionist mindset, whilst undeniably motivated by women's safety, is also driven by a desire to protect middle-class fields in the Bourdieusian sense from women who do not perform their sexuality in a manner befitting its standards. Kardashian is lacking in this framework the demure and stylish femininity that would have prevented criticisms of tastelessness from being directed at her. Kardashian's Vogue cover contemporary Jennifer Lawrence, by contrast, escaped this charge despite appearing on the September 2017 issue in a revealing red satin dress with the accompanying text American Beauty and the description that her photo shoot was transcendent. This really starts to look like a new way to regulate women's bodies. Incidentally, the two women were photographed by the same photographer in Annie Leibovitz, just an FYI. This project enters into the sexualisation debates at a time when the smartphone social media complex has created a seismic techno-cultural shift for photography, which has been largely advanced by the obvious tech, but also the ubiquitous selfie and in turn the sexy selfie. Prior to this shift, debates on the so-called sexualisation of culture were concerned largely with media representations of hypersexualised young women, the marketing of so-called sexy products to girls, sexual objectification, burgeoning internet porn, and the growth of what Ariel Levy termed raunch culture. Some aspects of feminism and popular commentaries have typically positioned the phenomenon of sexualisation as alarming and problematic for young people, and especially for young women. In fact, often when they say young people, they just mean young women. The headlines you just saw give some indication of the kinds of mainstream concerns which tend to range from the fear for young women's safety to loss of childhood innocence, to psychological and confidence damage, and also that they might be subject to new forms of patriarchal and commercial subjugation. And while there's merit, of course, in some of these concerns, they often mask a moral panic about some form of social destabilisation. They also, as sexuality scholars Kath Albury and Catherine Lumby point out in their submission to a parliamentary inquiry into sexualisation culture, imply that young women need protecting from sexually suggestive media and focus unfairly on what such media does to young women, rather than on how young women might use it for themselves. Kardashian's highly visible public life becomes then a touchstone for the ways in which women who take sexy selfies are subject to similar limiting discourses. The rapid rise of publicly shared sexy selfies by women has accorded with a rise in feminist and popular worries about them. Much of the academic analysis of Kardashian and similar everyday sexy selfies by other women has focused on post-feminist and neoliberal feminist concerns. My interest lies in examining the aesthetic components of sexy imagery, and in particular the ways visual culture is structured by the concept of taste, and how the language of taste is often used to marginalise the self-representational experiences of women who don't conform to dominant, classed and gendered constructions of tasteful, sexy aesthetics, so-called. So who's allowed to be sexy? Who gets to be sexy in the public sphere and in what ways? And these kinds of questions led me, well, to a feminist can of worms, frankly, but also to these pretty interesting photographic collaborations with a number of young women who regularly take sexy selfies for Instagram. I want to introduce you to them now and step through the creative process that was central to this project. So I should start also by saying that Paul touched on my background as a professional photographer. So I worked as a commercial portrait photographer for quite a while in Melbourne and a little bit in Sydney as well. And I had my clients ranged from sort of advertising to design clients and editorial. So I made the odd move into academia and wanted to use that kind of skill here. So that's, I'm hoping, is apparent in the conversations with, well, it was apparent with these women, and formed the basis of a compare and contrast method where we got to talk about professionalised sexy aesthetics next to amateur sexy aesthetics and why that matters. So just quickly, there were 10 women I worked with. There were 6 that shot with me that we collaborated on photo shoots together. It was during COVID as well, so it was a few less than I would have liked, but there were 6. And they were quite extensive projects too. So from the top left, it's Chris in the first 2, it's Blair on the 3rd one, you've got Mel top right, Simone at the left, the 2 at the left. That's Michelle, and I'm having a giggle because I'm not showing her face. Obviously, her Instagram feed when I first encountered her didn't have her face in any of her images. And it was only when we started shooting together that she came to a point of wanting to be photographed with her face visible whilst in revealing clothing, and now actually has an Instagram feed where her face is visible, but that was an appropriate image for her at the time. And this is Beck in the bottom right-hand corner. So all consent, of course, given for these images to be shown. And this is just a very quick overview of some of the images that we co-created. I'll show you a few more in a moment, but just to give you a sense of the project. So the method was, I didn't know any of these women, and I approached them on Instagram after I'd found their feed, and it seemed like a good choice. And somebody might have a question for me on that later on. Suggested to them that they just sent them a message and suggested that they might like to be engaged in a professional photo shoot that they could direct, and kind of treat me as if they'd commissioned me to do a shoot for them. So I got these women who generously offered me, their time, and the first thing we did was meet to have an informal chat, a semi-structured interview, I suppose, where I really kind of got them to talk to me about who they are and what they would like to be, if you like. By that I mean a sort of an aspirational self. So the first part of it was to write down 5 or 6 words to describe who they think they are, how they see themselves, and then another 5 or 6 words to describe their aspirational self. I suppose realistically that kind of idea of an aspirational self is very much embedded in commercial professional photography, and it gave us a chance to lift off in terms of what we might design for a photo shoot. We then did some location searching. There were some image references used, like mood boards put together. They mostly did that, and I'd feed back to them what I thought. So it was a genuine collaboration. Then we do the shoot, of course, and most of the shoots, and you can probably tell from the nature of these, were quite highly crafted. That tends to be the way that I work. And each one of them took, maybe 4 to 5 hours, sometimes in a studio, sometimes on a location at a location we'd found, and often with hair and makeup artists, perhaps a wardrobe stylist, occasionally a wig artist was involved. Second from the left bottom, there's a wig involved there. So they're really kind of highly stylised and structured shoots. After that, I would send them a lot of the images, not all. I'd sort of edit out the blinking shots, but I'd send them most. And then they were encouraged to put them up on their Instagram feed with captions, of course, and then we'd await to see what kind of feedback they got. Everyone put images up except one. So Beck, who's the middle at the top there, she chose not to, but everybody else did post a number of images. And it was a fascinating response from people and from them also in the way that they started to see themselves quite differently too. After that, we sat together and had another semi-structured interview. I'd sit with my computer and pretty well all of the photos and just have them talk to me about why they chose that one and not that one, how they experienced the photo shoot, what sexy meant to them and so on. I've got a couple of slides. In a couple of slides, I'll show you some sample questions too. And then I also put images on my Instagram feed and monitored comments. And of course, there was journaling along the way. What emerged were, with these images, what emerged were these kinds of images and an interesting picture of some of the stuff that I described earlier, and a bunch of things I wasn't expecting to, of course. Class and gender judgments were present in many of the conversations we had, and really without me prompting, they weren't leading questions. The language was never quite that direct about it, but certainly they were aware of where these images sit in the world and how limited their ability was to represent themselves as they wanted to, outside of kind of closed groups or supportive groups of other like-minded women online. This is just a quick sample of some of the questions. Obviously there were a bunch more than this, but just to give you a little bit of an overview of the questions that I asked. I'll let you sit with that for a second. Okay, now these were some of the findings. I'm certainly not going to open out all these findings today. It's a lot to go through, and really there were many more findings than this, but these were 4 key findings from the project. And the first, of course, is that language reveals what is valued. And of course, I'm looking here particularly at visual languages, but certainly the verbal languages that were used by participants compared with the kinds of languages that myself as a professional photographer or similar would use, made for an interesting contrast. The second one here is that beauty practices can be productive. So where we hear, as women and as feminists, a lot of conversation about the negative effects of beauty practices, and there's no denying that that's the case, and the standards that have been put in place for us, the old beauty myth is at play. All of the women I worked with in various ways found productive uses for beauty, and whether that was as they were received in the world or within their online supportive communities, it was a useful thing. The third one here is that to be looked at is not to be powerless. The sexy selfies have brought objectification and gaze discourses to what I think is a critical juncture. I think this is especially a conversation I'd love to have, on its own. Really, is this idea that, the rich history of women being photographed by men in various states of undress or otherwise, and being painted by men over centuries and centuries is rich. And we live in a time where cameras are available to pretty much everyone. Many women have taken the technology and decided to photograph themselves and seem to be at the highest point of criticism. So that's an interesting tale. Men are less involved, they're not mediators so much anymore, and yet the criticism is pretty thick. The last one here is naturalness discourses. So this was something that came through a lot, was the idea that the women I worked with understood that they were more valued if they appeared more natural. Take from that what you will, but the sort of sense that there's something real about that or authentic, and anything beyond that was plastic or fake. But often these naturalness discourses are operationalised to reinforce the classed ideals of a sort of appropriate, gentle, sweet, demure femininity. I'm just going to show a small handful of images here of each of the images you'll see are the co-creations of almost each of the participants. This is Michelle, and just a quote from some of them as well. I'll just roll through them and I'll linger on the last one and sort of unpack that in terms of aesthetics and comparisons. All right, I'll just use this last image here of Simone, who was the first woman to work with me, and some others. I'll show you Simone in a moment, to talk about the comparison between my professionalised aesthetics and the amateur everyday aesthetics in the selfies of women I worked with, and why it matters. So I bring to these images, obviously, my professional, academic, and inevitably middle-class aesthetic language. The visual style in the co-creations sit readily in an art or commercial photography canon. I'm interested in capturing a sexiness in Simone, and I want to do this with a visual language that's more coded or less direct than her own images. That is, that the image's semiotic components are suggestive rather than explicit, and they utilise visual tropes that are less immediately accessible than Simone's images. My time at art school taught me that the more densely coded that art is, the more highly prized it would be in the art world. Critique sessions taught students that if a work wasn't easily understood, it surely had an intellectual rigour to be applauded. Students were encouraged to obfuscate meaning in their work and deny the audience any easy interpretations. Academic staff spoke of sophistication, complexity, conceptuality and suggestion in their expectations of what artworks should contain. Though the term coded was never used, it's implicitly contained in the vague nature of this language and reveals what Laura Kipnis refers to as an aesthetic judgment masquerading as knowledge. Imbued in this language too is a distance from the everyday and its obvious class connotations. I could never embrace such an exclusionary, ascetic and arbitrary model of art appreciation. Yet I am conscious to encode these photographic collaborations with at least some of the signifiers which appeal to this aesthetic field, as an extension of my tastes and in the interests of my own cultural currency. Further shots of Simone, all of these co-creations with her. So I do this with lighting that evokes a sombre mood, lenses which create a sense of distance from or unusual closeness to Simone, the addition of a mask on Simone's face or a trench coat worn provocatively, the moody cityscape, the intentional lens blur movement, narrative suggestions, and the privileging of a mirror to ironically illustrate the vanity narcissism commentary that flourishes in selfie discourses. In comparison with Simone's photographs, the images are gentler, darker, and her body is more hidden. They're crafted with a conscious attention to a contemporary, professional portrait style with a chiaroscuro, which promotes intrigue and evokes an emotional response. Simone holds the camera's cable release, that's in that one, sorry, and others like it, simulating the taking of a selfie while I do the shooting, to complicate the subject-object discourses. So I invite a deep looking. I want the viewer to question what is going on and to be seduced by the dark mood. I'm careful to light the edges of Simone because I know this provides shape and visual interest. I have my audience in mind and I know how to reach them. I'm appealing to what Skeggs terms the bourgeois gaze, though I'm not conscious of this until I reflect on it later. Like Simone, I too seek a desirous gaze, one whose approval allows me continued access to some of the most exclusive spaces in visual and intellectual culture. With this in mind, I must consider if my own set of aesthetic codes helps to demarcate a class boundary which both affirms and extends my own cultural capital and marginalises women's vulgar, and I use the term here objectively, displays of sexuality. As many scholars writing on class note, distance from working class objects is a requirement of establishing the middle class field. Though I'm loath to admit it, perhaps my visual language inclines toward a kind of aesthetic respectability and suggestive eroticism which satisfies the tastes of those for whom everyday sexy selfies are too much, too overt, too vulgar. It surely protects my place in the social field and reinforces class distinctions. The participants demonstrate an awareness of these nuanced languages in visual culture. They know the power of certain types of photographs to produce normative ideals of female sexiness, and still they complicate these ideals. Simone states her belief that professional images contain a classiness that amateur sexy selfies do not. She speaks of sexiness as aesthetically overt and classiness as that which is hidden. Another participant, Beck, describes her experience shooting collaboratively. She says, "It was sexy, but in an empowering way. It was a different kind of sexy. It also showed me that I don't have to show as much skin as I can to be seen in a sexual way. Facial expressions, the way I point on my toes, I'd never really thought about it before. I see sexy and free in a different way now." Their particular reading of sexiness into their own images and our collaborations highlights how judgments of taste ascribe value to these images and to the women who make them. Bourdieu emphasises that art achieves its value and codings not through internal readings, but discursively, through social power and hierarchies of difference. Writing further on this, Sally Munt suggests that the working class aesthetic is a dominated aesthetic. It's often aware of its impropriety and lack of authority in an alien judgment world. Power structures in visual culture push these amateur voices to the margins while elevating the professional one. It's an insidious process where professional photographers are granted a legitimising function. That is, there is a trust that our gaze will make legitimate a subject who might otherwise be accorded marginal status by a dominant group. As photography critic Stephen Fraley notes with regards to a photo of a homeless woman taken by famous photographer Andre Serrano, Serrano uses the visual rhetoric of formalised portraiture that gives currency to the prominent, to recognise and elevate those without, thus seizing the language of power to portray the powerless. This is not to suggest that the project's participants were powerless, this was far from the case. But it remains a difficult truth that my professional gaze and aesthetics accord with some measure of cultural exclusion. Another photo critic, Vicky Goldberg, astutely points out that the nude itself may not be the point of the picture, but only nominally the subject. The real subject is the photographer's aesthetic allegiance. This is Michelle. Though my photographic gaze is not unproblematic, and I entered into these collaborations with the power that comes with the aura of academia and as a professional photographer, there is too a knowledge exchange that's occurred between myself and the women I worked with in this collaborative process. We developed an intersubjectivity based on mutual respect, trust and a willingness to support each other's respective desires for seenness. I was and remain conscious of the obvious imbalance of power between myself and the participants. The sheer nature of my inviting them into the project can serve as an unfortunate reminder to them that they are regarded as different and are asked at times to justify their choices to make sexy selfies. Women's place has been indeterminate and peripheral in photographic cultures and industries and in conversations about sex. Our sexual desires and fantasies have largely been relegated, ignored, stigmatised and shamed. Male fantasies, however, are written onto billboards, magazine covers, into songs, poetry and literature and show up in countless movies. As a commercial photographer asked oftentimes to reproduce these stereotypes for mainstream media and advertising, I've wondered whether within systems of image making and the broader system of masculine dominance, women's sexual selves can be seen in ways that do not relate necessarily with male desire. And yet, while photography is complicit in some of the structures which enable male dominance, it's rapidly affording new spaces for female visionaries, many of whom are demanding to be seen in ways which do not necessarily involve men and which firmly ask for a gaze of respect. And it's an easy brush stroke, so to speak, to discuss photography's complicity when ultimately it has been networks of privilege and power which have used photography's tools to amplify its own voices and suppress others. Voice requires recognition and needs to be valued rather than simply facilitated. As the academic call to effectively listen to those with less access to privileged spaces rises, might it also include visual voices, the aesthetic standpoints of women for whom sexy selfie making is an important practice of sexual selfhood. Presenting oneself to be looked at can be an expression of power after all. And there is a broader feminist call for a greater consideration of the resistant possibilities of femininity, which certainly extends to the effective feminist potential of rude, sexy, feminine aesthetics. Women who take sexy selfies produce the possibility of transgression through new sexual subjectivities and a rejection of the regimes of shame so often found in this territory. The images that myself and participants co-created and the processes surrounding them provide a unique and vital insight into the representational subjectivities of each participant. They also offered a touchstone for examining how visual legitimacy is conferred by cultural gatekeepers and that certain visual signifiers carry more cultural value than others. Critics in this domain are largely unable to allow for the effective feminist potential of sexy female representation, less mediated by men than ever before. As Finnish scholar Hille Koskela argues, sometimes it is more radical to reveal than to hide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Emma. That was fabulous.
Artie.
Thanks, Emma. That was really super interesting. So thank you so much. I had kind of like maybe two questions. I guess one was more emerged at the start with the stuff around the Kardashians, and I kind of wondered partially, and maybe this relates to some of the stuff around class and taste, the role of whiteness in that, because I think the fact that she's even gotten on the cover might mark a shift in her aesthetics away from essentially stealing a certain kind of aesthetics from the black community, black culture, which she's been heavily critiqued for, to her more recent aesthetic shift to, I would say, more whiteness-based aesthetics. So I was just wondering if you could, think of, I thought I wouldn't want to assume the kind of cultural backgrounds of the people that you were working with, but I think it's interesting to think about whiteness. Obviously, there's these ideas of like white trash as well, and trashiness. The proximity of the word white to the word trash also has its own kind of meaning. So I'm kind of interested in that as well. But my other question was actually, I had my class yesterday, we were talking about the gaze and the male gaze, and we were reading Bell Hooks' Oppositional Gaze, and I was talking to the students about their use of Instagram and stuff like that, and a lot of the students were saying, all my female students were saying, oh, I go through, I look at all my friends' photos, and I'm like, oh, you're so hot, girl, like you look great, like all these women like going through kind of commenting. So I'm kind of wondering a bit more about who the Instagram audiences of these women are, and like again, because I think there is these multiplicity, the whole gaze thing, subject object thing just doesn't. It's too narrow, as you highlighted really well. But then, like, what's actually going on when these people are flicking through these photos and commenting, and who's doing it, and how does it cross over? And one of the male students was saying, like, oh, he's not sure if he should comment on photos like, oh, so sexy, or if it's always going to be assumed that he's interested in that woman. And then they had this really interesting discussion about their own practices, I guess, commenting on people's images on Instagram. So I'm just kind of keen to hear more about that.
Adi, thank you for all that. As you were talking and reflecting and asking me things, my mind's just gone in like a dozen different directions about an answer, and I feel like I've got to like spin the wheel and see where I land on what my answer's going to be. Maybe I'll work backwards. The gaze stuff is, that became a point in my PhD where I really stumbled, in the sense that, as you correctly point out, there are so many reflections and critiques of shifts in the gaze. I've recently been reflecting on the original work by Laura Mulvey, where she termed that, male gaze and women as looked at and men as the looker, as in fact to, flattening of, it's very binary anyway, but also to flattening of the two genders she refers to, and perhaps does men a disservice in many ways as well, straight men a disservice. I also think we need to start saying straight male gaze, because that's what it means, right? Yeah, but there was something about the women that I worked with having a real sense of the gaze of each other, I suppose, without them saying that. And my personal response to that is that wasn't problematic necessarily. In fact, that there were these really quite unique and deeply supportive communities that were forming on Instagram through social media that would, relate to real life as well, though it doesn't have to, that, come from that gaze and from a particular shared aesthetic that allowed that gaze and that form of sexuality to be, or, sexualness or something, to have a life, I suppose, where they might experience people outside of those communities or in the so-called real world judging them, and they had a lot. Some of them had boyfriends that had real problems with them and so forth. So that probably doesn't really answer that question about the gaze very well, but it's a reflection on. And then your first question about whiteness and Kardashian, I think that it's really interesting. There's kind of two arms that I think. First is, you're right about the shift that Kardashian's made, I think, and Anna Wintour kind of picks it up, right, that she's becoming more, or has become more clothed, if you like, more covered, and therefore more respectable by the codes of those kinds of aesthetics. And I think more white in a sense, like no one says it in quite so blunt a term, but that's what it is, and putting herself on the cover of Vogue and so on. And it is back to those ideals of femininity that are not just demure and polite, a sort of sexual decorum about it, but also white, definitely. So that I'm not going to speak to it too much because I didn't deal with race in my PhD. But you're also correct to pick up on the white trashy thing that exists, and that's kind of where I wanted to go with the PhD and these women. So it's sort of like two aspects of it, isn't it? Where there's the respectable whiteness, but something else as well. As I'm talking and thinking, well, all of that really points to the fact that it's white people that are dominating the discourse on it then. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. That was great. I also have a art school photography background, and so your comments about critique brought me out in a rash. So true. So many things interested me about that, and my question might be a little off-piste, so forgive me if it is. So my question might be a little off, left of centre. I was struck by a couple of things. I think you said that only one of your collaborators chose to put one of your images.
They all chose to put images that we worked on together, except one.
Oh, except one. Okay. Because I was thinking about the comparison, because yours, have this beautiful lyric quality. There's a very sophisticated aesthetic and narrative. And so I was wondering about, the comparison on that same platform. But I also couldn't help thinking, as I was listening to you and looking at those images, of the parodies that Celeste Barber does, and and how that kind of factors into the whole feminist argument.
Yeah, great. No, thank you for the question. Just before I talk about Celeste, I'll say that I perhaps should have said it in the presentation, but Beck was the woman who didn't choose to put any images up. And the reason she gave me was, because I gently asked her, the reason she gave me was that she felt, it sort of took her a while to spit it out, but she felt that she was going to be judged by her peers for being like too above herself, like she'd gone above her station. Yeah, which is another class dialogue in itself. And I was like, wow, I never actually had thought of that. So that was really interesting. She also, there's so many chapters in this particular project, but she also had suffered from terrible anorexia when she was a teenager, mid-teens, hospitalised level of anorexia, and got to sort of 18, 19, recovered her health well enough that she started to take photos of herself in this sexy attire. And she has an uncle or something who has an apartment in Melbourne who's never there, and she sleeps there a lot. So she'd use this space to take photos of herself as a way to become on terms with her body again and find a pride and a power in her body. So all these kind of stories, I think, that just don't get heard, or we assume that she's just going for a particular male gaze or something, but there's actually a real power in what she was doing. Celeste kind of hit her stride, I think, at some point, maybe in the middle of my PhD. And I had a lot of friends going like, oh, have you seen this? And of course, it's hard not to love Celeste Barber, right? I get a good laugh. And I was for a while a bit torn, because I think she is, she's taking the piss out of these women, and she's kind of shaming them at the same time. So this is one of the key areas of my work that I'm hoping we can look at, is the amount of shaming that women get for the choices they make around bodily display. And at the same time, it's some of the women she's, parodied are just so confected and so shallow, it's hard not to, it's a real bind. I find that tough, and I'm glad you raised her. Anybody else with thoughts on Celeste, please jump in.
Riley.
Okay, I have two, if that's okay. My first was, I was wondering your thoughts about like how, because all of this is the people that you engage with, have their Instagram pages and stuff, and I wonder what your thoughts are about how like that sort of increase in, the way that like the average person objectifies themselves through like engaging on the internet, how that coexists with like even the story that you mentioned about sort of reclaiming some self-love and overcoming shame and things like that, when like there's this weird sort of space of like posting and having that picture be seen in a way that is sort of flattening to the person themselves, because it's, as everything, it's just a complete complex mess. And then the other one I was hoping to get your thoughts on is how, because you were talking about the difference between doing having these like professional, maybe these other people's shoes are more professional, but like their framing is kind of amateur. How like the role of like just artistic skill, like how that intersects with some of these concerns that you've raised and identified around, class and power and privilege. Because when you were talking about some of the like framings that you considered when you were doing these shoots, I do creative writing, and so I was thinking about that sort of difference between someone who is not, does not know,
Not trained.
who doesn't. It's like that difference. Like you can. Once you know how to use the rules, then you can chuck them out because you know what you're doing, right? And how much of that plays a role into like some of the choices you make, the artistic choices you make, versus like upholding, certain ideas around beauty, which, because I'm sure there is like, coexist as well.
Yeah.
Sorry. Complicated.
Thank you. I think that's a really great question, and it's something I gave a lot of thought to and don't have any clear answers on. But another of the points that was quite a difficulty for me was coming to this idea that, I'm a trained professional and I obviously have pride in my skill and my abilities. I still do as I speak to you now. And realising that with that training I've got, I also get, a privilege from understanding the rules, the codes, the aesthetics, which allow me access to, some of the best, the sort of top, if you like, Australian media and so forth, which, is an incredible privilege, right? And also coming to understand that what I learn in photography school or art school or a design school or anywhere else is fantastic, but also not inherently the truth of what our aesthetics are. Our aesthetics are culture. They're based in culture. You know, that's the point. And whether that culture is, ethnically based, whether it's class based or age based or anything else, cultures come in all forms, right? Yeah, and it's that bit that I think we miss. There's some sense, I think, in a lot of our, especially fine art spaces, where there's a real sense that there's an inherent truth to the richness or beauty in the artworks, whether they're sexy artworks or otherwise, which I really challenge, because I think that's just a learned standard we've put in place, and they get utilised often, and it's not the only way they get utilised, but they do get utilised often to demarcate class lines, so we know who doesn't belong. Firstly, I think you mentioned the words self-objectification, which I personally think you can't do to yourself, because I think somebody else always objectifies you. And also notably that the word objectification in and of itself has come to be shorthand for the sexual objectification of women, when actually we objectify in many other ways that have nothing to do with sex or women. So firstly, a challenge on the way we use that language. And then the women I worked with would never, I think, have seen themselves as self-objectifying, or of it's quite a harmful thing to be objectified by somebody else. So to do it to self was, I don't think, in their thinking at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, it's just when I was using the phrasing of objectification, I suppose I was thinking about how when we engage with things online. I mean, you even said online versus in the real world, and that sort of almost derealization of, like, so objectification in that way, making things like the way that we engage with things as if they're not real. Just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, not totally sure where to go with that. I suppose there's something around the online space that allows the realization of these, sexual subjective selves, which maybe doesn't exist so easily in the so-called real world. I mean, online is the real world too. We've got to change this language as well, I think. But that may be the case. Like I lament, as many of us do, the death of Tumblr, because Tumblr was such a fabulous space. Yeah, we laugh at Tumblr, right? But it was such a fantastic space for a lot of queer kids, particularly, to find themselves and find each other and be recognised and seen, So, and lots of sexual stuff was there, and that's why it got shut down by, moral panic, American moral panic. I'm not sure I quite answered that, sorry, but I appreciate the contribution. Thank you. Alison.
Emma, thank you. I'm fascinated by this. It's a wonderful talk. And it made me think of something that I experienced that really surprised me. And I just wanted to share it with you and see if it sparked anything for you. So my background has a lot of dance in it. And I've known Elizabeth Cameron-Dalman, who's one of Australia's foremost dancers for decades. And she regularly has groups of people I watch. I'm not dancing as one of these, but groups of beautiful dancers dancing their own creations at her studio in performances. And I saw this dance done by two women. It was choreographed by one of them, so she was dancing her own dance, but she'd also taught the other part to another young woman who was dancing that. And the choreography on the person who had choreographed it, I found so raw as to be quite shocking. I did struggle not to feel embarrassed, sort of shamed, whatever. Those are big words, but it was just so raw. The same movements on a different body, and these were not. It was not a sexual dance at all, particularly. It was just a contemporary dance, but the same movements on the other woman's body. I don't know. There was a separation there that there wasn't in the moves on the person who choreographed them. And your comments about the photos that people took of themselves, the sexy selfies, and the sexy selfies they took with you reminded me of that separation.
That's a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing. It's kind of, I feel like since doing this project, I can't look away from those kinds of things, and I realise how perhaps colonised we are by the kind of thinking that regards particular bodies as the correct bodies or appropriate bodies or more valuable bodies or more attractive bodies or whatever it is, And with all of that is, of course, the old stuff around power, and that's what gets the greatest airtime in our media, whether that's movies, film, TV, advertising, and so on, is what's going to inform how we view the correct and valuable body, the most attractive body. And we all know what that is. It's white, young, smooth-skinned, Western, And I think, and demure, and appropriately feminine. And anything that sits outside that is a challenge to that often. And I think it really, I'm on a soapbox now, but I think it really is important from a feminist perspective that we embrace, I mean, it sounds, that's kind of, that's problematic too. Check ourselves in what we've been, how we've been fed this kind of stuff, I suppose, and allow space for all bodies. I don't know if that addresses what you said also, Alison, but fascinating story, I appreciate it. I'm curious to ask you a question actually. Can you elaborate on the difference between those bodies?
Both of them were beautiful bodies, actually. The choreographer was slightly older. I mean, she was probably late 40s. The younger dancer was probably 20s. But the older person had a really beautiful body. There was no difference in flexibility. She wasn't a larger body. None of the things that quite commonly are seen as less feminine. No, they were both beautiful dancers and beautiful bodies. But there was just a rawness about her own choreography. It was like, wow.
Yeah, she's, I assume from what you're saying, so contained in herself, so that her power is all here, something like that.
It was more like she emanated power. Whereas the younger dancer was going through the movements very beautifully.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a shock for a lot of us too, that, with women with that much power, we actually don't see it that often. Yeah.
There's one online. So, Michael Chisnell, great stuff, Emma. Did your female collaborators have a general view of who should be looking at the pics, the target? A spectrum of gender or themselves?
Michael, thank you. Yes, they didn't explicitly talk about it, but, a couple did actually. One in particular was Michelle, robustly told me that she didn't do her shoots for anybody but herself. And I heard this from a couple of women, and I challenged her slightly on that, if you will. So I want to say that her voice, of course, is incredibly valuable, but she's also putting her photos up in a public space. So there has to be an audience with that, right? So I think there's something to unpack around the relationship between the shooter and audience that perhaps doesn't get opened up enough, and that can actually be quite an unproblematic thing. One of the things I often got asked during this project was, why do you think they do it? Because it's such an odd concept. It certainly was a few years ago. Why do you think they do it? And the answer I want to give is a really boring answer, and they do it for fun. They just do it for fun. So I might put my own photos up on Instagram for fun, whatever those photos are, and I'm hoping that you'll engage with them and like them just as these women did. And we do a lot of things just for fun, right? And it is quite a boring answer because we want something much richer than that, and we want the male gaze in there, and we want to talk about feminism and how bad it is and all that stuff. But actually, it's pretty simple. And I think that the fact that we sort of really get challenged by it says a lot about what we don't allow in the fun realm. But otherwise, I mentioned earlier that many of them shot, I think, for each other in support of their various online communities. And I don't know that was an inherently or an obviously chosen thing, or that they're aware of that, is what I'm trying to say. Perhaps when it was pointed out they were, but that doesn't have to be there either. They just sort of naturally or organically come to exist, but I think they get, it sort of fosters more and more of it. And I would also say that there were definitely 2 or 3 participants who were quite happy to tell me that they were interested in men looking at them, that they wanted to attract men, and that they were totally fine with that, and they couldn't understand why anybody had a fucking problem with it. Fair enough, right? Sexual beings.
Okay, thanks, Emma. That was just wonderful. Just so many different ideas and a whole coalescence of different theories. I'm interested in the word space. It's a really difficult word, but we use it really simply. So we have a artistic space, or we might have a photographer's space, or we might have a person space, or we might have other spaces. And I notice that the title is about the space that has been created by these women themselves. So it is their self space with you're going to put a label on it, and I don't have any trouble with that, but you've called it a self-sexy space. And then you've changed the coordinate systems. So instead of the coordinate at the central point is the individual who's created this space, you've created another space where you come in and create a coordinate system where that space is gradually seen by you of their space, and you bring that out in an art form or an academic form or an interest form, which becomes really interesting. And I'm just interested because you've taken their space, sort of made it your space, and where that overlap is.
Oh, look, that's a fascinating question, thank you. And I'm a bit challenged by it, if I'm honest, because what you're touching on there is probably a bit of discomfort I feel now, perhaps less then, because I was probably not as aware a couple of years back. But, you know, there's always that, not always, there's often that unfortunate thing as researchers of people that we are extracting, you know, from them. There's an extracting going on that's hard to avoid in research, and at the very least needs to be acknowledged. And I probably didn't acknowledge it very well at the time, but it certainly is a coming together of spaces, if you like. Maybe that's a nice way I like to put it for myself. I say that carefully because I don't feel like that I intruded on this space. I hope that's not the case. And there was certainly a new space brought, as you identify, that is the connection points between us and then what we created together. So that wasn't just the output, though that's obviously important, but it was the processes and the meeting and the conversations on text and phone calls and so forth as well. And it's a meeting of worlds that don't normally meet, I suppose. So, you know, I do think quite a bit about how that, and I haven't thought about it in terms of space, and I appreciate you saying that because it's got me thinking in different ways now, but how those kinds of spaces can be fostered or you know, continued in some way, because you know, I sort of, you know, arrive here and we're in the ivory tower again, and it's easy to talk about and keep extracting, and I'm sort of safe and comfortable, but how do we make them larger, and that real feminist praxis work of actual collaboration, you know? I don't have a clear answer.
Emma, superb. That was really fascinating. Can I just ask, you said you reached out to all the women via Instagram. How did that go? Because obviously they didn't know you, right? So you didn't know them. Yeah. It was just a case of, hey, I think you're cool. It was just a slogan. Yeah. So I guess questions about rapport and trust.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go.
You're going to make me be honest about something I didn't want to have to address, but here we are. So they were direct messages. I'd met a woman in Melbourne just before I started my PhD, or perhaps right at the start, who was a dancer at one of the clubs in Melbourne and a sexy selfie taker, and she was doing her master's at RMIT. And we obviously connected and had good chats, and she put me onto a couple of her friends on Instagram. It started the, you know, purposive sampling and so on. So I would message them and say, hey, basically what you've just described, you know, like I'm doing this crazy project, I'm a professional photographer, and I actually listed a number of my clients thinking that, you know, I'll be sweet here because I've shot for Rolling Stone, right? And I got such few hits that it was such a blow to my ego. It was like, okay, no, I'm different. They don't need me, right? And there's another chapter again, which I didn't write, which maybe I will one day. There's another chapter again on how, on the, you know, the lack of need for professional photographers in these kinds of image making realms, right? Like really. And I've been doing some work, my more recent research is with women athletes and their self-representational practices. And I've been fortunate enough to be in spaces with elite players in their change rooms and so on, with camera in hand. And they're great with me, and I get lots of good shots and all that stuff. But there are so many cameras kicking around the room, whether it's their own, with each other, whether it's media managers at a club or media themselves, external media, you know, that I'm like, wow, everyone's got a camera in their back pocket, you know, we're not needed anymore in the same way. And I think therefore the kind of professional aesthetics that I think are valuable, they don't care about either. In fact, the DIY selfie thing holds more currency, actually. Yeah, so it was a real blow to me, so I had to push pretty hard, and lucky I got them. Thanks for asking. Also, I should say that each of the participants pretty well, I think, were, you know, quite political and clear in their views about the kind of sexy landscape that they're sitting in. So I think that's also why they were interested in being a part of it. They got what I was doing. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Pleasure.